My husband spent years gaslighting me into believing I was losing my mind, all to hide a terrifying secret hidden beneath our basement floor. But when I finally uncovered the truth, I realized the nightmare wasn't just my house. It was a global operation that had been waiting for me to break all along. Mark and I had been married for 6 years, and for 5 of those, our relationship was the envy of everyone we knew. We were partners, equals, and most importantly, we were a team. That was until the arrangement began. It started subtly, with casual comments about how lonely my mother-in-law Evelyn was in her massive empty house. Then, it escalated into guilt-tripping sessions where Mark would sigh, stare at the ceiling, and talk about his filial duty. When he finally dropped the bomb, that he wanted us to move in with her to save money and provide company, I fought him. I loved my privacy, my autonomy, and the life we had built. But Mark was relentless. He painted a picture of a domestic utopia, a multi-generational home filled with laughter and support. Against my better judgment, I relented. I packed up my belongings, surrendered my office space, and moved into Evelyn's Victorian estate. The house was cold, filled with shadows and the lingering scent of mothballs, and Evelyn, a woman who wore her disapproval like a sharp, heavy cloak, greeted me with nothing but a thin-lipped glare. The transition was agonizing. I was no longer a wife in my own home. I was a glorified live-in housekeeper, expected to manage the bills, the garden, and Evelyn's erratic whims while Mark spent longer hours at the office. The turning point came on a Tuesday. I had come home early, exhausted from a grueling day at work, only to find the entire house in complete disarray. The front door was swinging wide open, letting in the biting autumn chill. I rushed inside, calling out for Evelyn, but the house was silent. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I raced to the living room, expecting to see her sitting in her armchair, but instead, I found the floor covered in shattered porcelain and torn photographs. At the center of the chaos sat Mark, his head buried in his hands, surrounded by a stack of legal documents I had never seen before. He looked up at me, his face pale and uncharacteristically fragile. Before I could even ask what happened, he reached out, grabbed my wrist, and whispered, "I had to do it. She's gone, and she's not coming back. But you need to know where I hid the keys." The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I pulled my arm away, my skin crawling, as I looked toward the staircase leading to the basement. The door, a door that had been locked since the day we moved in, was standing slightly ajar, and from the darkness below, I heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a phone vibrating on the concrete floor. I stared at the basement door, my breath hitching in my throat. Mark's eyes were fixed on the floor, his shoulders shaking with a silent, jagged tension. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run out the front door, get in my car, and never look back. But the vibration persisted, a rhythmic, mechanical buzzing that echoed up the wooden steps like a countdown. "Mark, what did you do?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum. "Where is she? You said she was in the hospital for her checkup. You said you took her yourself." Mark finally looked at me, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't recognize the man staring back at me. There was a hollow emptiness behind his eyes that made my blood run cold. "She didn't want to go, Sarah. She fought me. She told me she'd rather rot than leave this house, and I couldn't let that happen. Not after what she told me about your family." My pulse spiked. What did my family have to do with this? I took a tentative step toward the staircase, my hand trembling as I reached for the light switch. Mark didn't stop me. He just sat there, watching me with that eerie, detached calm. I clicked the switch, but the bulb flickered once and died, plunging the hallway into a deeper, more oppressive gloom. "Don't go down there," Mark said, his voice dropping to a low, warning rasp. "If you open that door, there's no going back to the life you think you have." I ignored him, my hand finding the cold iron handle of the basement door. I pushed it open, the heavy wood groaning in protest. As the door swung wide, the smell of damp earth and something metallic hit me. I squinted into the dark, and there, sitting on a wooden chair in the middle of the room, was an empty nursing home uniform, neatly folded. Beside it sat a leather briefcase I had seen in our bedroom just that morning. I took another step down, the stairs creaking under my weight. I reached the bottom floor, my eyes adjusting to the low light filtering in from the small barred windows near the ceiling. That's when I saw it. Taped to the basement wall was a series of Polaroids, dozens of them, all showing me sleeping in my bed, taken from angles that were impossible. I turned around to confront Mark, but the basement door slammed shut above me, and the distinct sound of a deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the silence, followed by the muffled sound of Mark's phone dialing 911. "Hello, police?" Mark's voice was clear, calm, and terrifyingly steady through the thick wooden door. "Yes, I need to report a domestic disturbance. My wife, she's had a complete mental breakdown. She's locked herself in the basement and she's holding my mother hostage." My blood turned to ice. I pounded on the door, screaming, "Mark, open this door! You're insane! Call them back!" "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he shouted back, his tone dripping with a rehearsed, pathetic sorrow. "I tried to get you help. I tried to make you see that you were losing your mind, but you wouldn't listen. Now you've left me no choice." I backed away from the door, my heart racing. If the police came, they would find me here, in a basement full of stalker photos, with no evidence of my own innocence, and a husband who had clearly spent months crafting this narrative. I turned my attention to the rest of the basement, frantically looking for a way out. This wasn't just a cellar, it was a prison. The windows were reinforced with iron bars, and the walls were lined with soundproofing foam. He had been planning this since the moment we moved in. I scrambled toward the back of the room, moving boxes and heavy storage trunks, desperate for a crawl space or a loose panel. My fingers brushed against a cold metal box tucked behind an old water heater. I pried it open, hoping for a tool or a spare key, but instead, I found a stack of medical records. They were in my name. As I flipped through them, my vision blurred. They were falsified psychiatric evaluations dated months ago, claiming I had been suffering from violent delusions and paranoia. Each one was signed by a doctor I had never met, and each one listed Mark as my primary caregiver. He hadn't just been planning to lock me up. He had been systematically dismantling my reality, one document at a time. I heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. My time was running out. I turned to the back wall and noticed a strange seam in the foundation, a small recessed section that didn't look like concrete. I pushed against it, and a panel slid open just enough to reveal a narrow, dusty crawl space that led into the neighboring property's backyard. I squeezed through, scraping my skin against the jagged edges of the opening, and tumbled into the damp grass of the yard next door. I stood up, gasping for air, ready to bolt toward the street, when I heard a soft, wheezing cough coming from the bushes directly behind me. I spun around, and there, tied to a tree with heavy rope, was my mother-in-law, Evelyn, her eyes wide with terror and her mouth taped shut. She looked at me, then at the house, and violently shook her head, gesturing toward the street where a car was pulling up. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a police cruiser. It was a black sedan with tinted windows, a car I had seen idling outside our home for the past 3 days. My mind raced. Was this Mark's accomplice? Or something even worse? Evelyn was struggling, her eyes pleading with me, but she wasn't looking at me, she was looking past me, at the figure emerging from the car. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a folder that looked identical to the one Mark had been clutching earlier. He didn't look at the house. He walked straight toward the hedge where I was hiding. "Mrs. Miller?" the man called out, his voice smooth and professional. "We've been expecting you. Your husband called us ahead of time. He said you might try to run." My legs felt like lead. I had to choose, help Evelyn and get caught, or run and leave her to whatever fate Mark had planned for her. I looked at the tie binding her wrists. It was fraying, but not enough to break. I looked at the man in the suit, who was now only 10 feet away, his hand reaching into his jacket. "Stay right where you are," he warned, his voice dropping an octave. "We have orders to bring you back to the facility, one way or another, and I'd advise against making a scene." I realized then that this wasn't just a domestic dispute. The nursing home wasn't a nursing home at all. It was part of a private network of facilities that could make people disappear. Mark wasn't just a greedy husband, he was part of a system. I looked back at Evelyn, who had finally managed to wiggle her mouth free from the tape. "Run, Sarah," she rasped, her voice trembling. "They aren't taking me to a home. They're taking me to the clinic. And you're the donor." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Before I could process what she meant, the man in the suit lunged, and at the same moment, the front door of the house burst open, and Mark stepped out, followed by 2 uniformed police officers. He stood on the porch, looking perfectly composed, and pointed directly at me. "There she is," Mark shouted, his voice cracking with feigned relief. "Officer, thank God." "She's the one who kidnapped my mother." As the police began to sprint toward me, I felt a sharp sting in my neck, a tranquilizer dart. I stumbled, the world tilting on its axis as the man in the suit caught me before I hit the ground. My vision darkened, but not before I saw Mark walk over to Evelyn, pick her up as if she weighed nothing, and whisper something into her ear that made her go completely limp. As I drifted into unconsciousness, the last thing I heard was Mark's voice, cold and clinical, saying to the officers, "Don't worry about the noise. She's been delusional for weeks. She won't remember any of this when she wakes up." The darkness wasn't a void. It was a rhythmic, synthetic hum that vibrated against my skull. I tried to move my fingers, but they felt like leaden weights pinned to a cold, sterile surface. My eyelids fluttered, struggling against a heavy, chemical lethargy. Every time I inhaled, the scent of antiseptic and ozone stung my nostrils, sharper than any hospital, colder than any morgue. I wasn't in a bedroom. I wasn't in the basement. I was in a place designed to erase. When I finally managed to force my eyes open, the blur resolved into a ceiling of harsh, flickering fluorescent panels. I was strapped to a medical cot, my wrists secured with heavy-duty leather restraints. To my left, a bank of monitors chirped a steady, mocking rhythm, a digital heartbeat that wasn't mine. "She's conscious," a voice said. It wasn't Mark's. It was hollow, detached, and utterly devoid of human warmth. I turned my head, the effort sending waves of nausea through my body. Standing by a glass observation window was a woman in a lab coat, her face obscured by the glare. Beyond her, in the viewing room, I saw him. Mark was leaning against the wall, sipping a cup of coffee as if he were waiting for a flight at an airport terminal. He wasn't crying. He wasn't relieved. He was looking at a digital clipboard, his thumb scrolling through data points that looked suspiciously like my own vital signs. "Mark!" I tried to scream, but my throat was scorched dry, the sound coming out as a pathetic, raspy hiss. "Mark, let me out! What is this place?" He didn't flinch. He didn't even look toward the glass. He just tapped his finger on the screen, and the monitors beside my bed spiked in intensity. Suddenly, the room began to vibrate, a low-frequency thrum that made my teeth ache. "The donor transition is reaching peak compatibility," the woman in the lab coat said, typing something into her own terminal. "The trauma of the abduction has accelerated the cortisol levels perfectly. She's primed." Donor. The word burned into my brain. I struggled against the straps, the leather biting into my raw skin. I looked at my arm, and for the first time, I saw the IV line snaking into my vein, feeding a glowing violet fluid into my system. It wasn't medication. It was something else. Something that felt like liquid ice spreading through my veins, chasing away the lethargy and replacing it with a terrifying, hyper-aware clarity. My senses exploded. I could hear the hum of the electricity in the walls, the distant thud of a heavy security door closing 3 hallways away, and the muffled sound of Mark's voice as he finally spoke to the woman. "Is the memory wipe ready?" Mark asked, his voice crisp and professional. "The first phase begins now," she replied. "Good," Mark said, finally walking toward the door of my room. He stopped in the threshold, looking down at me with an expression of profound, surgical indifference. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, Sarah, but you were always so inquisitive. If you had just stayed in your lane, if you had just played the part of the doting wife for a few more years, we wouldn't be here. But you started digging. You found the bank statements, you saw the nursing home invoices, you were a liability." He leaned closer, his breath cold against my ear. "Do you know what happens to people like us when we have debts that can't be paid in cash? We pay in biology. You're going to be a very valuable asset to the company, and honestly, you'll never have to worry about rent or groceries ever again." He turned to leave, but as he reached for the door handle, the entire facility plunged into absolute darkness. The monitors flatlined. The violet light in my IV stopped flowing. A red emergency strobe began to pulse, bathing the room in a rhythmic, hellish glow. In the sudden silence, I heard a voice, not over an intercom, but whispered right next to my head, coming from the ventilation grate just above my cot. "Don't move," the voice hissed. It was Evelyn, but it wasn't the frail, broken woman from the garden. Her voice was sharp, steady, and terrifyingly cold. "I didn't lose my mind in that house, Sarah. I was building a resistance. Mark thinks he's selling you to the clinic, but he forgot one thing. I'm the one who owns the shares." A small metallic click echoed in the room as my wrist restraints popped open. I scrambled up, my muscles screaming in protest. Evelyn's hand reached through the vent, holding a jagged piece of glass and a small electronic keycard. "He's coming back in," she whispered, her voice tightening. "And he's not alone. He's brought the security team to finish the extraction. You have 2 choices. Run through the service tunnels and pray you don't get lost, or take the syringe from the tray behind you and show them exactly what happens when you turn a victim into a predator." I looked at the tray. Beside a set of scalpels sat a syringe filled with the same violet fluid that had been coursing through my veins, but the label on the vial didn't read donor. It read Subject 0. The door handle began to turn, slowly and deliberately. Mark's shadow stretched across the floor, long and predatory. I grabbed the syringe, my hands steadying, and realized with a sickening jolt that the door wasn't just being opened, it was being hacked from the outside. "They're here, Sarah," Mark said from the other side, his voice dripping with false, cheerful malice. "Are you ready to be the best investment I've ever made?" The door swung open, and the lights flooded back on, blindingly bright. Mark stood there, flanked by 2 men in tactical gear, but he stopped dead in his tracks. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the vent above my head, where a small, red laser dot was dancing across his forehead. I gripped the syringe, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure, unadulterated rage. "Mark," I whispered, stepping off the cot, the cold floor biting into my feet. "You forgot one thing. I'm not the donor." I lunged toward him, but before I could reach his throat, a deafening explosion ripped through the exterior wall of the room, and the ceiling began to collapse, raining concrete and steel down upon us all. Through the smoke, I saw a figure leap from the crater, a figure wearing the exact same mask as the people who had abducted me. They weren't here to save me. They were here to claim the prize. The blast threw me backward, pinning me against the far wall as the world dissolved into a cacophony of screeching metal and choking dust. I didn't feel the pain of the impact, The violet serum still coursing through my system acted like a jagged, electrified armor, keeping my senses pinned to a razor's edge. Through the swirling haze of debris, I watched the tactical team fall, not to bullets, but to the newcomer, a ghost in a matte black suit who moved with a fluidity that bordered on the inhuman. Mark was scrambling toward the hole in the wall, his face a mask of panic, leaving his colleagues to die in the wreckage. He didn't care about the facility or the investment. He only cared about his own skin. I looked down at the syringe in my hand. The liquid inside was bubbling now, reacting to the sudden drop in pressure from the breached wall. I realized then that the serum wasn't meant for extraction. It was a catalyst. "Evelyn!" I screamed, turning toward the ventilation shaft. But the shaft was empty. In its place, a small silver drive hung from a wire, pulsing with a faint blue light. I snatched it, my fingers burning as the metal seemed to sap the heat from my skin. The figure in the black suit turned toward me, their mask reflecting the red strobe of the emergency lights. They didn't speak, they didn't attack. They simply pointed toward the gaping hole in the wall, the only exit to the outside world. Outside, the night air was biting, and beyond the perimeter fence, I could see the flashing lights of a dozen approaching vehicles. Not police, not the clinic. These were heavy, armored transport trucks marked with a symbol I recognized from the fake medical records in the basement. A stylized, interlocking set of human molars. The clinic wasn't a hospital. It was a harvest site. I scrambled through the rubble, my breath hitching as I stepped over the bodies of the guards. I reached the edge of the crater and looked down. Below was a sprawling subterranean complex that went down for levels, glowing like the guts of a neon beast. It wasn't just a building, it was an industrial factory for human biology, and I was standing at the very top of it. "Sarah!" Mark's voice echoed from below. He had scrambled down to a lower catwalk, his hand gripped around a flare gun. He looked up, his face twisted in a snarl of desperation. "You have no idea what you're holding. That drive contains the keys to the entire network. If you take that outside, you're not just a victim anymore. You're a target for every ghost in this shadow government. Come down here and we can strike a deal. I can get you out of the country." I looked at the blue light of the drive in my palm, then at the vast, dark forest beyond the fence. I knew what would happen if I turned it over. I knew what would happen if I stayed. I looked back at the masked intruder, who was now holding a detonator, their finger resting on a single red button. They weren't waiting for me. They were waiting for me to choose. "Evelyn, are you out there?" I whispered, hoping, praying, that she was watching from the trees. A static-filled voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through the wail of the sirens. It wasn't Evelyn. It was the woman in the lab coat, her voice cold and triumphant. "You think you've escaped? You've just activated the containment protocol, Sarah. Look at your feet." I glanced down. The concrete floor beneath me began to slide away, revealing a circular shaft that dropped into a bottomless, spinning centrifuge. The walls of the room were retracting, and the entire platform I was standing on began to rotate, spinning faster and faster, generating a G-force that pulled my limbs toward the outer edge. I lost my footing, sliding toward the center, toward the gaping, mechanical maw that threatened to swallow me whole. I reached out, my fingers clawing at the edge of the shifting floor, but my grip was slipping. The masked figure stood at the edge, watching with cold calculation, while Mark began to climb back up, his eyes locked on the drive. "Hand it over, Sarah," he roared over the sound of the grinding machinery, "or we all go into the shredder." I held the drive up, the blue light reflecting in the swirling darkness below. I felt the serum in my veins reach a boiling point, my vision turning a violent, saturated crimson. I realized that the only way to destroy the facility was to force the overload. I didn't reach for Mark. I didn't reach for safety. I reached for the central power conduit exposed by the blast. As my hand closed around the vibrating high-voltage cables, I felt a surge of energy so intense it forced me to scream. The room erupted in a blinding flash of white light, and for a split second I saw the true face of the person beneath the mask. My heart stopped. It wasn't a stranger. It was me, or rather, a version of me that looked like I had lived through a lifetime of this, scarred, aged, and holding a twin of the drive I clutched in my own hand. "They're coming, Sarah," my double whispered, her voice a mirror of my own. "And you have exactly 5 seconds before they realize you're not the one they're looking for." The floor beneath us vanished entirely, and as we plunged into the dark, I felt the sharp, cold sensation of a needle piercing my neck from behind, the same one Mark had used in the garden. I realized with a final, sickening jolt that I wasn't falling into the shaft. I was waking up in the basement 6 months ago, with Mark standing over me holding a breakfast tray and a smile that never reached his eyes. The clatter of the breakfast tray hitting the concrete was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I sat bolt upright, my lungs screaming for air, my skin slick with a cold, frantic sweat. I was back in the basement. The walls were gray, damp, and perfectly intact. The Polaroids were still taped in rows, watching me with their jagged edges. Mark stood in the doorway, the morning sun casting a long, sinister shadow across the floor. He held a cup of coffee and a sympathetic smile, the exact same one he had worn 100 times before. "Nightmare again, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice dripping with that patented, honey-coated concern. "You were thrashing in your sleep. I told you, the stress of the move is just getting to you. Why don't you have some breakfast?" I looked at my hands. They were shaking. I could still feel the phantom sensation of the electrical current burning my palms, the ghost weight of the blue drive in my grasp, and the terrifying, hollow gaze of the woman who looked exactly like me. My head throbbed with a persistent rhythmic ache, and as I blinked, I saw a faint crystalline residue on my wrist, the exact spot where the tranquilizer had pierced my skin in the vision. "How long have I been asleep, Mark?" I whispered, my voice sounding like gravel. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the basement as if checking for something he had left behind. "Just a few hours. You were exhausted after the argument yesterday about the, nursing home situation." I didn't answer. I focused on the wall behind him, looking for the seam, the hidden panel that led to the neighbor's yard. It was gone. The concrete was smooth, unbroken, as if no crawl space had ever existed. "I have a surprise," Mark continued, walking over and kneeling beside the cot. He reached out to stroke my hair, but I flinched, pulling away. His expression didn't change, but his eyes went flat, dead, like a shark's. "I called the facility. They agree with me. You're not getting better, Sarah. You're getting worse. So I've decided to move the timeline up. We're going to the clinic today. For your own protection." He stood up, pulling a pair of metal restraints from his pocket. He wasn't playing the loving husband anymore. The mask had slipped, and underneath was a predatory, cold efficiency that chilled me to the marrow. "You're not taking me anywhere," I said, my voice suddenly steady. I reached under the thin, stained mattress, not feeling for a key, but feeling for the specific hollow point in the floorboards I had seen in my dream. My fingers found a loose nail, a jagged piece of rebar I had tucked away in the sequence of events that felt like a lifetime of trauma. Mark laughed, a low, dismissive sound. "Sarah, look at you. You're in a basement, in your pajamas, talking about reality. You've already lost. There is no escape from this arrangement." He lunged for me, his hands reaching for my throat, but I was faster. I rolled off the cot and jammed the rebar into the electrical conduit running along the wall, the same spot I had hit in the vision. The basement exploded in a shower of sparks. The lights hissed and died, plunging us into total, suffocating darkness. But this time, I wasn't blind. I moved by memory, by the map of the nightmare I had just lived. I ducked under his wild swing, heard his knuckles crack against the concrete wall, and scrambled toward the corner where I knew the hidden, heavy-duty fire extinguisher was stored. I didn't hesitate. I swung the steel cylinder with every ounce of rage I had stored over 6 years of gaslighting and imprisonment. It connected with a sickening thud, and Mark slumped to the floor, silent and still. I didn't stop. I ran to the stairs, burst through the basement door, and sprinted into the living room. The house was exactly as it had been, but I didn't see the furniture. I saw the wiring, the surveillance cameras hidden in the smoke detectors, the microphones behind the wallpaper. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and began to systematically destroy everything. I smashed the monitors, ripped the wires from the walls, and shattered the hidden hubs of the surveillance system. When I reached the front door, I didn't run. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my own phone, which I had managed to keep hidden in the lining of my robe for weeks, and tapped the upload button on the cloud backup I had been quietly building for months. I walked out onto the porch just as the driveway filled with headlights. The police weren't arriving to arrest me. They were arriving because I had sent the decrypted files, every invoice, every medical record, every recording of Mark's admissions, to the local precinct, the FBI, and the news stations. Mark stumbled out of the house behind me, dazed and bleeding, trying to shout, trying to spin his final lie. But he stopped when he saw the armada of blue and red lights. He looked at me, and for a second, he looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't understand how his perfect reality had crumbled so thoroughly. I didn't look back as they dragged him away. I didn't look back at the Victorian estate or the life I had built under the shadow of a lie. As the sirens wailed in the distance, I walked toward the edge of the property line. Standing near the tree line was a woman, her face partially obscured by the morning fog. She was holding a small blue drive. She nodded at me, a brief, sharp motion, and then stepped back into the shadows and vanished. I reached into my pocket and felt the small, sharp sting of a needle that wasn't there anymore. I was free. But as I watched the police swarm the house, I caught my reflection in the window of a cruiser. I looked older. My eyes held a depth of cold, calculated survival I hadn't possessed a day ago. And I realized then that while I had escaped the house, I would be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. The nightmare was over, but the war for my own existence had only just begun. I turned, walked toward the waiting world, and for the first time in 6 years, I decided exactly where I was going to go. And I didn't care who followed.